They never saw it coming, but justice did. David Walker never expected a fight before his flight. He paid for his first-class tickets, just like everyone else. He followed the rules. He did everything right. But the moment he and his family stepped into that airport, they were treated like they didn't belong. Ignored at check-in, questioned at boarding, humiliated in front of an entire cabin. The message was clear. This world wasn't built for people like them to sit in luxury. His wife, Laura, held her head high, but David saw the way her hands trembled when she gripped their daughter's shoulders. His 10-year-old son, Jacob, sat in silence, staring at his shoes. Not out of boredom, out of shame. And the worst part? No one cared. The flight attendants sneered, the passengers looked away, and the whispers were louder than the plane's engines. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that someone was watching. Someone with power. Someone who wasn't going to let this slide. By the time this plane landed, their world would never be the same. What would you have done in David's place? Have you ever witnessed discrimination like this? Comment your thoughts and where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to stand for justice. David Walker adjusted the worn strap of his duffel bag as he stepped into the check-in line with his wife, Laura, and their 2 children, Amelia and Jacob. It was supposed to be a day of excitement, flying first class for the first time, a long overdue family trip that took them years to afford. But from the moment they arrived at the airport, something fell off. The check-in counter had multiple open stations, yet no one called them forward. They had been standing there for nearly 20 minutes, while passengers behind them were helped immediately. "Excuse me," David said politely, raising a hand. The airline employee, a blonde woman with a tight bun and a sharp uniform name tag Chloe, barely glanced at him before shifting her attention back to a well-dressed couple approaching the counter. "Welcome, sir, ma'am," she greeted them with a bright smile, scanning their tickets immediately. David exhaled, tightening his grip on his daughter's hand. Laura, standing beside him, frowned. "They're just ignoring us." "I see it," David muttered, keeping his voice low for the kids' sake. The line dwindled, but every time their turn arrived, the agent at the counter suddenly became busy, typing, making a call, whispering to a coworker. Other passengers breezed through check-in in seconds. But for the Walkers, it was as if they were invisible. Finally, after nearly 40 minutes, Chloe sighed dramatically and gestured them forward. Next, David stepped up, handing over their tickets. Chloe took them with the same enthusiasm someone might reserve for picking up trash. Her eyes flicked over their names before she tapped at her keyboard, her lips pressing together in something that almost resembled disapproval. "One moment," she muttered. Laura crossed her arms. "Is something wrong?" "No," Chloe replied curtly, still typing. Then, with a voice that carried a forced sweetness, she added, "I just need to verify some things." David exchanged a look with his wife. The pit in his stomach grew heavier. Amelia, only 7, tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, why do we have to wait so long?" He forced a smile. "No reason, sweetheart. Just a little mix-up." After a few more agonizing minutes, Chloe finally slid their boarding passes across the counter. "There you go." David reached for them, but she didn't let go immediately. She looked at him, then down at his faded jeans and slightly worn sneakers. "First class?" she asked, voice dripping with skepticism. "Yes," Laura said firmly, taking the tickets from her grip. "We booked them months ago." Chloe just hummed in response, as if she didn't quite believe it, then turned away before they could say anything else. Relieved to be past the first hurdle, the Walkers made their way toward security. But just as they were about to step forward, another airline worker, a man in his 40s named Mark, jogged toward them. "Mr. Walker?" David turned. "Yes." Mark had a forced smile. "I'm so sorry, but there's been a small issue with your luggage." David tensed. "What kind of issue?" "Well," Mark began, rubbing the back of his neck, "it looks like your checked bags were mistakenly routed to the wrong destination. We're working on retrieving them, but for now, we can only guarantee their arrival within the next 24 to 48 hours. Laura's eyes widened. "Wait, so we won't have our bags for the trip?" I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience." David took a slow breath, trying to stay calm. "What about our carry-on?" Mark motioned to the single small bag David had slung over his shoulder. "That's all you have, right?" David clenched his jaw. The kids had clothes in the lost suitcases. Laura had packed all their essentials in them. His nice blazer, the only formal piece of clothing he owned, was gone too. "Look," Mark continued, his tone dismissive, "these things happen. You'll get your bags eventually. Until then, you can always buy what you need when you land." David stared at him. Buy what we need? Did they think money grew on trees for them? This trip was already stretching their budget thin. Every dollar had been carefully planned. "We'll manage," Laura said softly, placing a hand on David's arm. It wasn't worth making a scene. Not yet. Mark gave a half smile before walking away, without another word. David adjusted his grip on Amelia's tiny hand and looked at his wife. Laura squeezed his fingers. "It's fine. We still have the trip ahead of us." He nodded, but a bitter thought crossed his mind. If they were already being treated like this before even boarding, what was going to happen once they stepped on that plane? David tightened his grip on his daughter's hand as they neared the boarding gate. He tried to shake off the uneasy feeling from the check-in counter, but it clung to him like a bad omen. Laura was quiet beside him, clearly thinking the same thing. Ahead, a flight attendant in a sharp Navy uniform, her name tag reading Jessica Reed, stood near the gate, chatting with a coworker. Her blonde ponytail was tight, her makeup pristine, and her expression unreadable, until her eyes landed on them. Jessica's smile flickered, then vanished entirely. She exchanged a quick glance with her coworker before picking up the microphone. "Attention passengers," she announced, her voice carrying over the low murmur of the crowd. "Before we continue boarding, we need to verify some ticketing issues. If you have a first-class seat, please have your boarding pass ready." David frowned. That was strange. The line was moving fine, until now. No one had been asked to verify anything before. The first-class passengers ahead of them had walked through, without so much as a second glance. Jessica's eyes flicked back to them. "Let's start with you," she said, waving them forward. Laura stiffened. "Is there a problem?" Jessica's smile was thin. "Just a routine check." David forced himself to stay calm. "Routine check. Right." He handed over their tickets, jaw tight as Jessica took her time scanning them, flipping them over as if she were deciphering some hidden code. She tilted her head. "First class, huh?" Her tone dripped with disbelief. David kept his voice even. "That's what the ticket says." Jessica didn't move. The line behind them was growing, restless murmurs breaking out among the other passengers. A man in a business suit sighed audibly, shifting his weight impatiently. Another attendant, a younger brunette named Lisa, stepped forward. "Jessica, everything looks fine." Jessica cut her off. "I'd like to double-check with the system." Lisa hesitated, then gave a small nod and stepped back. David exhaled slowly, biting his tongue as Jessica typed unnecessarily long into her tablet. Amelia shifted beside him, her tiny fingers gripping his wrist. "Daddy," she whispered. "It's okay, baby," he murmured, squeezing her hand. Jessica finally sighed, handing back their tickets. "All right, you're clear." No apology, no explanation, just dismissal. David took the boarding passes and stepped forward, but Jessica's voice rang out again. "Oh, one more thing." He turned, barely masking his frustration. "I need you to remove your shoes." Laura inhaled sharply. "What?" Jessica crossed her arms. "Security procedure." "That's funny," David said, voice flat. "Because we already cleared security." Jessica shrugged. "Sometimes additional checks are required." David glanced at the passengers behind them. No one else was being stopped. No one else was being asked to take off their shoes in the middle of the boarding area. The humiliation of it burned through him, but Amelia was watching, her big brown eyes filled with confusion. He wouldn't let her see him break. Without a word, he bent down and untied his sneakers, stepping out of them and setting them aside. Laura hesitated, then did the same. Jessica gave them an expectant look. David clenched his jaw. You want the kids to do it too? Jessica gave a slow, exaggerated blink, as if considering it. That won't be necessary, she finally said, her tone sickeningly sweet. David took his shoes back, sliding them on with a practiced calm. Laura's hands were shaking slightly as she did the same. Jessica smiled, stepping aside. Enjoy your flight. David took his wife's hand and led their children past the gate. The moment they stepped onto the jet bridge, Laura let out a shaky breath. They wanted to humiliate us, she whispered. David didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew the truth. David guided his family onto the plane, forcing himself to stay calm. Laura was still tense beside him, her fingers twitching as she adjusted Amelia's tiny backpack. The humiliation at the gate still clung to them like a shadow, but the goal now was to settle in, breathe, and move past it. At least, that's what David told himself, until they reached their seats. Row 2A and 2B, first class. Plush, wide seats with extra legroom, or at least that's what the online photos had promised. But when David stopped beside them, something was off. The seat cushions looked oddly compressed, and the recline button on his chair was missing. Jessica, who had somehow materialized behind them, smirked. Ah, you must be the Walkers. David exhaled sharply. Yes. Jessica made a show of glancing at her clipboard. Oh dear. Seems like there's been a small issue with your seats. Laura stiffened. What kind of issue? Jessica clicked her tongue. It appears as seat mechanism is broken. Won't recline properly. And 2B has some padding issues, but I'm sure it's still comfortable enough for you. David clenched his jaw. Is there another available seat? Jessica's smile widened. First class is full. David stared at her. He'd seen at least 3 empty seats while walking in. But before he could argue, the businessman in 3A, a balding man in an expensive suit, cleared his throat loudly, giving David a pointed look, as if telling him to drop it. Laura touched his arm. Let's just sit, she murmured. David lowered himself into the stiff, uneven seat, feeling the broken mechanism dig into his back. Laura sat beside him, shifting uncomfortably. Amelia curled up on Laura's lap, hugging her stuffed bunny. Jessica leaned in. I'd hate for you to be uncomfortable, but I suppose you're used to that, right? David turned his head slowly. Excuse me. Jessica blinked innocently. Well, you know, some people are more accustomed to luxury than others. It's just an adjustment. David's fingers curled into fists. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the sharp prickle of rage just beneath his skin. He wanted to say something, to push back, but then Jacob, his 10-year-old son, looked up at him with wide, worried eyes. David inhaled deeply, unclenching his fists. We'll manage. Jessica straightened, pleased, and turned to walk away. 5 minutes later, the temperature in the cabin began to drop. Laura shivered, rubbing Amelia's arms to keep her warm. David flagged down a passing flight attendant, not Jessica this time, but Ryan Miller, a tall man with neatly combed hair and an air of forced politeness. Excuse me, can we get a blanket for the kids? Ryan barely looked at him. We're out. David frowned. Out? But I just saw you hand one to the woman in 4C. Ryan glanced over his shoulder, then shrugged. She requested it earlier. David clenched his jaw. So did we. Ryan sighed, tapping his pen against his notepad. Look, sir, there are limited supplies. We prioritize passengers based on need. David stared at him. And my kids don't need one? Ryan smirked slightly. I mean, they're young. They'll be fine. Laura tightened her grip on Amelia, her expression unreadable. She was used to swallowing her pride, but David could see it cracking at the edges. David looked back at Ryan. Are you seriously telling me you have nothing left? Ryan's smirk widened. Pretty much. He leaned in slightly, voice dropping. But hey, I'm sure you've handled worse, right? David's fists curled again, but he forced himself to relax. He could feel every set of watching eyes in the cabin, waiting to see if he'd snap, waiting to see if he'd prove their unspoken assumptions about him right. He took a slow breath. We're fine. Ryan straightened, clearly satisfied, and walked away. They weren't the only ones who noticed how cold it was. Several passengers draped in thick blankets barely seemed to care, their comfort secured. The walkers, however, had been written off. David exhaled, trying to calm the frustration pressing against his ribs. He wasn't going to let them break him. Ryan Miller strolled back into first class, a small bottle of cologne in hand. He sprayed a light mist near a row of passengers, smiling and making small talk as he moved down the aisle. Then, as he reached 2A and 2B, he aimed the bottle directly at David and Laura, releasing 3 sharp sprays into the air. The sharp scent of citrus and musk burned David's nose, making Laura cough as she turned her head away. Ryan smirked, shaking the bottle, as if inspecting how much was left. "Just freshening up the cabin," he said lightly, not bothering to hide his amusement. David's jaw clenched. "You didn't do that anywhere else." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Did I not? Huh. Guess I missed a spot here." Laura gripped David's arm, silently pleading with him to let it go. Jacob shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the tension suffocating. Ryan took one last, smug look at them before turning away, moving back toward the galley. Jessica, watching from a few rows ahead, smirked and whispered something to another attendant, who chuckled in response. David forced himself to breathe, to focus on keeping his family calm. He could handle humiliation, but watching his wife and kids endure it was something else entirely. Minutes later, Jessica picked up the cabin microphone. She cleared her throat, her voice saccharine sweet as it echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our in-flight service, I just want to take a moment to thank you all for choosing our airline today. We're especially proud of our commitment to inclusivity and our dedication to providing opportunities for all travelers, regardless of background or financial status." David's grip tightened around the armrest. Jessica continued, "It's truly heartwarming to see our first-class cabin open its doors to guests from all walks of life. We believe that travel should be accessible to everyone, no matter their circumstances. So let's all celebrate the fact that luxury doesn't have to be reserved for just the elite." A few passengers glanced at the walkers. One man in 3A smirked, shaking his head as he sipped his champagne. Jessica's eyes flicked to David, amusement flickering across her face as she set the microphone down. David kept his face blank, but inside something burned. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she framed them, twisting what should have been an ordinary flight into a spectacle. She wanted to make sure everyone on that plane knew exactly who didn't belong. Laura exhaled shakily, turning toward him. She did that on purpose. "I know." Jacob lowered his head, staring at his lap. "Are we poor?" he asked softly. David's stomach clenched. "No, then why did she say that?" David glanced at Jessica, who had moved to chat with a wealthy-looking woman in 1C, her laughter ringing through the cabin. Amelia had dozed off against Laura, shivering slightly. Jacob sat with his arms crossed, staring at the seat back in front of him, refusing to meet his father's eyes. The silence between them was thick. The scent of fresh food filled the cabin as flight attendants rolled the meal cart down the aisle. Rich, steaming plates of salmon, roasted potatoes, and warm bread were carefully placed in front of each first-class passenger. Glasses of fine wine clinked softly. David's stomach twisted with hunger, but more than that, he could feel the familiar sting of being ignored. Jessica and Ryan moved with practiced ease, handing out meals row by row. When they reached 2A and 2B, they skipped right over them without a glance. David clenched his fists under the tray table. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The flight attendants returned to check on the other passengers, topping off drinks and exchanging pleasantries. Plates were cleared. Fresh cups of coffee were poured. Still nothing for them. Jacob swallowed hard. "I guess we don't get to eat," he muttered. His voice was dull, empty. David's chest tightened. "They'll bring us soon." Laura rubbed her arms. Silent. Another 10 minutes. Then finally, Jessica strolled toward them, holding 2 trays. She set them down with a loud clatter, the silverware rattling against the cheap plastic. The food on the plates looked cold, congealed, like it had been left out far too long. The bread roll was hard, the butter unmelted. Jessica smiled. "Hope you don't mind, we had to," she gestured vaguely. "Prioritize service for our frequent flyers first." David didn't move. Laura picked up her fork, stabbing at the rubbery salmon. Jacob poked at his food, then pushed a plate away. "I'm not hungry." Jessica smirked and turned away. David exhaled through his nose. "Eat, Jacob." "I don't want to." "Eat." Jacob's hands curled into fists. "Why?" "So we can pretend like everything's fine." David had no answer. Minutes later, the attendants came back to clear the trays. Ryan stopped beside David's seat, holding a large black trash bag. "All right, folks, let's clean up." Jessica approached from the other side, holding another bag. But instead of reaching for their trays, she dropped the bag right into David's lap. The greasy smell of half-eaten food and crumpled napkins hit him immediately. Jessica tilted her head. "Do you mind taking care of this? Since you're already sitting there, might as well make yourself useful." David's hands locked around the bag, the plastic crinkling under his grip. Laura stiffened beside him. Jacob's face burned red. Jessica tapped her foot, waiting. David's fingers twitched. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Slowly he stood. The entire first-class cabin had gone quiet, forks scraping against plates as eyes flicked toward them. David turned toward the galley. Without a word, he walked past Jessica and dropped the trash bag onto the floor at her feet. Jessica's smirk faltered. "Oops," David said flatly. For the first time, she looked genuinely surprised. But then she laughed, shaking her head. "No need to be dramatic." She kicked the bag aside. "I was just trying to help you feel comfortable. You seem like the hands-on type." Ryan snorted. The businessman in 3A chuckled behind his glass of whiskey. David turned and sat back down. Jacob whispered, "I hate this." The humiliation of being forced to clean up still lingered in the air, but David forced himself to focus on keeping his family steady. Then came the next blow. A man in 3C, dressed in an expensive navy suit, waved down Jessica. "Excuse me," he said, voice smooth, calculated. "I'd prefer to sit by the window." Jessica's eyes flicked toward David's row. Her lips curled. "Of course, sir. Let me see what I can do." David already knew what was coming. Jessica strolled over, placing a perfectly manicured hand on David's headrest. "Mr. Walker, I'm going to need you and your family to swap seats." David's hands locked around the armrests. "Our seats are assigned. We're not moving." Jessica's smile didn't falter. First class is about making passengers feel comfortable. And Mr. Porter here has been flying with us for years. It's just a small favor. David didn't move. Jessica's voice dropped just loud enough for him to hear. "It's either you switch seats, or I can always call security and have you moved." Laura's grip on Amelia tightened. Jacob's head sank lower. David swallowed hard, then nodded stiffly. "Fine." Jessica beamed. "That's the spirit." They were shuffled to the last row of first class, directly next to the galley, where flight attendants bustled back and forth, bumping into their seats every few minutes. Amelia stirred, whimpering. "Mommy, I need to go potty." Laura brushed her daughter's curls, unbuckling her seatbelt. "Okay, sweetheart, let's go." She stood, leading Amelia toward the restroom at the front of the cabin. But before they could reach it, Jessica stepped in their path. "Where you think you're going?" she asked, arms crossed. Laura blinked. "The restroom." Jessica shook her head. "First-class restrooms are reserved for priority passengers." David sat up straighter, his muscles tensing. "We are first-class passengers." Jessica barely spared him a glance. "Like I said, priority passengers. The economy restroom is in the back. Feel free to use that one." Amelia gripped Laura's hand tighter, her little body shaking. "Mommy, I can't hold it." Laura gritted her teeth. "She's 7. Jessica shrugged. "And?" Amelia's breath hitched. "Mommy, please," she whispered. David's hands curled into fists. He started to stand, but Laura placed a hand on his chest, shaking her head slightly. "Not yet." Instead, she turned back to Jessica, her voice eerily calm. "Move." Jessica sighed dramatically, then stepped aside at the last possible second, making sure Laura had to brush against her shoulder to pass. David watched his wife and daughter disappear behind the restroom door, his pulse pounding in his ears. Jacob sat beside him, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hate this." David looked at his son. The boy's shoulders were curled inward, his fingers digging into his jeans. He didn't look angry. He looked ashamed. Jessica wasn't done. She walked past their row, a cup of water in hand, and with a casual flick of her wrist, spilled it onto the floor near their feet. The ice scattered, melting into a small puddle. Jessica gasped dramatically, loud enough for passengers in the front rows to turn their heads. Oh no, someone made a mess. She placed a hand on her hip, eyes narrowing. "Mr. Walker, was this you?" David's jaw locked. Laura straightened. "You just..." Jessica cut her off with a raised hand. "I mean, we can't have spills in first class. It's a safety hazard. If you can't keep your area clean, maybe it's best you sit somewhere easier to manage." David's grip on the armrest tightened. He felt Jacob tense beside him, fists clenched. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Passengers glanced their way, some shaking their heads. Jessica tapped a finger against her lips, as if thinking. "Actually, I have an idea." She snapped her fingers at Ryan, who immediately appeared at her side. "Ryan, we should move them. We can't have them disturbing our priority guests." Ryan smirked. "Where to?" Jessica tilted her head toward the galley. "Back there. By the service area. Should be quiet enough." David stood abruptly, the chair creaking beneath him. "Sir," Ryan raised a hand, faking concern. "If you don't cooperate, we'll have to report this." Jacob stared up at his father, his eyes desperate, pleading. David saw it then. The fear, the shame, the way his son wished he could disappear. He let out a slow breath. "Fine." Jessica clapped her hands together, all but beaming. "Wonderful. Right this way." They were forced to stand and move past rows of staring passengers, past eyes that either pitted them or judged them. The murmurs followed them down the aisle like ghosts. They reached the galley, where the cramped jump seats were folded against the wall. Jessica pointed. "Make yourselves comfortable." Amelia whimpered, gripping Laura's sleeve. David sat first. The seat was stiff, barely cushioned, the kind meant for flight attendants during takeoff, not passengers paying thousands for first class. Laura settled in beside him, cradling Amelia. Jacob hesitated, his face twisted with humiliation. "Sit, Jacob," David said quietly. The boy lowered himself onto the seat, his head ducked. Jessica leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "This is much better. Now everyone can relax." A small chuckle came from one of the front rows. The businessman in 3A smirked, sipping his drink. Jessica turned, clearly pleased with herself, and sauntered back toward the main cabin. David sat still, staring ahead. His fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Jacob didn't speak. Amelia buried her face in Laura's shoulder. David sat in the cramped jump seat, his back aching from the stiff cushion. Amelia shifted in Laura's arms, her small frame curled tight. Jacob hadn't spoken in minutes. The humiliation had settled deep, pressing into David's ribs like a weight he couldn't shake. Then, from the last row of first class, a man stood. A tall, silver-haired figure adjusted the cuffs of his jacket, moving with unhurried precision. Robert Langford had been silent the entire flight, a passive observer. But now, his presence filled the cabin like a gathering storm. Jessica barely noticed at first, still reveling in her small victory. Ryan nudged her, muttering something under his breath. But when Robert stepped into the aisle, the energy shifted. Passengers fell silent. The businessman in 3A, who had chuckled earlier, suddenly looked tense. Robert pulled out his phone, pressed a single button, and lifted it to his ear. His voice, smooth and controlled, cut through the air. "Richard, it's me." Jessica's breath hitched. Robert continued, his tone smooth but firm. "Listen, I'm on flight 162, and we have a problem." He paused, glancing at Jessica, then let out a low chuckle. "No, worse than that. Your crew just made the worst mistake of their careers." Jessica stiffened. Ryan's fingers tightened around his tray. Robert shook his head slightly. "I want the plane grounded the second we land. Get your people ready. And Richard, make sure they understand exactly who they just messed with." Jessica took a step forward, forcing a polite smile. "Sir, is there something I can assist you with?" Robert didn't even look at her. "Yeah," he said into the phone, slipping it back into his pocket. "Tell security to wait at the gate." Jessica's face went pale. Passengers exchanged frantic glances, sensing the shift in power. Robert turned, his sharp blue eyes locking onto David for the first time. He walked forward, each step deliberate, then extended a hand. "Get up." David hesitated. The entire cabin was watching. The people who had laughed at him, the ones who had ignored him, the ones who had pretended none of this was happening. Robert's voice remained steady. "You've sat in filth long enough." Jessica went rigid. Ryan took a step back. David slowly reached out, gripping Robert's hand. His muscles ached, but as he stood, something else took over. The weight of shame began to lift. Passengers whispered frantically. The shift was undeniable. Someone with real power had spoken, and it wasn't Jessica. Robert turned to face her. "I'll see you on the ground." Jessica couldn't breathe. Ryan went rigid. For the first time all flight, David Walker wasn't the one people were staring at. The storm had arrived. Jessica sat frozen, her mind racing as the plane began its descent. The once light-hearted cabin had turned eerily silent. Every passenger knew something big was happening. The weight of Robert Langford's phone call still hung in the air, a warning that the balance of power had shifted permanently. David sat taller now, his hands no longer clenched. He wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't the one in trouble. The landing gear deployed, and a ripple of tension spread through the first-class cabin. Jessica gripped the back of a seat, her knuckles white. Ryan fidgeted beside her, eyes darting toward the cockpit. As the plane touched down, Jessica swallowed hard. Then she saw them. Through the small window, standing on the private runway, was Richard Hayes, CEO of the airline. He wasn't alone. 5 security officers flanked him, their expressions unreadable. Jessica's breath came short. Ryan whispered, "We're screwed." The plane rolled to a stop. The moment the doors opened, Robert Langford was the first to step out. He didn't need to announce himself. The CEO's entire demeanor shifted the second he saw him. "Robert," Richard greeted, his voice calm but carrying a dangerous edge. Robert adjusted his cufflinks, giving a small nod. "We need to talk." Richard's gaze shifted behind him, landing on Jessica. Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. "Out," Richard ordered. Jessica hesitated, but the security officers moved forward, leaving her no choice. She stepped onto the jet bridge, her stomach twisting. David and his family remained seated. No one had told them to leave. Jessica walked down the steps, each movement heavier than the last. The passengers, who had once smirked with her, now avoided her gaze. She came to a halt before Richard, forcing a tight smile. "Sir, I can explain." The slap came so fast she didn't even see it coming. A sharp crack echoed through the air as Richard's palm collided with her cheek, snapping her head to the side. A collective gasp came from nearby crew members. Jessica staggered, her ears ringing, her face burning. Richard's voice was low and lethal. "You just cost me everything." Jessica's vision blurred. Richard stepped closer. "Did you think no one would notice? Did you think humiliating a passenger, a paying customer, in front of an entire first-class cabin wouldn't get back to me?" Jessica opened her mouth, but no words came. Richard's eyes burned into her. "Get off my runway." 2 security officers grabbed her arms. Passengers watched from the windows as Jessica was dragged away, her once perfect uniform now wrinkled, her carefully curated persona shattered in an instant. Ryan tried to slip away unnoticed, but Robert turned. Him too. Ryan froze mid-step as 2 more guards moved in. His protests were ignored as he was yanked down the jet bridge. Inside the plane, Jacob peeked toward the window. "Are they arresting him?" David let out a breath. "Something like that." Laura, still holding Amelia, finally allowed herself to relax. Jessica's footsteps scraped against the tarmac, her wrists locked in the unforgiving grip of security officers. Ryan struggled beside her, muttering frantic excuses, but no one was listening. The moment they crossed into the terminal, they were escorted straight through a set of double doors. Their careers ended before they even understood what hit them. Richard turned back to Robert, exhaling sharply. "You were right," he muttered. "This was bad." Robert smirked. "You have no idea." The CEO straightened his jacket before stepping toward the plane. David and his family were still seated, watching the chaos unfold. Passengers stole glances at them, some suddenly too ashamed to make eye contact. Richard stopped at David's row. "Mr. Walker," he began, voice measured, "I owe you an apology." David held his gaze. "That won't change what happened." Richard nodded. "No, it won't. But this might help." He reached into his inner pocket, pulled out a checkbook, and signed his name with a single fluid motion. Tearing it out, he extended it toward David. David hesitated, then took it. $1 million. Laura gasped softly, her fingers tightening around Amelia. Richard's expression remained firm. "This isn't just about you. It's about making sure this never happens again. This airline will implement mandatory anti-discrimination training, restructure our policies, and hold every employee accountable, starting today." David glanced at the check, then at his children. He wasn't just taking this for himself. He was taking it for them. Richard stepped back, looking at his watch. "A car is waiting outside to take you wherever you need to go." His gaze softened just slightly. "I hope you still enjoy your trip." Laura wiped at the corner of her eye. "Thank you." Robert clapped a hand on David's shoulder. "Next time you fly with me." David managed a small, genuine smile. "I'll hold you to that." As they stepped off the plane, the weight they had carried since takeoff was gone. No more whispers. No more humiliation. Just the open air and a future that, for the first time in a long time, felt different. And Jessica? Jessica never worked in aviation again. The end. Justice has been served. The Walker family not only received an apology, but also $1 million compensation and a commitment to systemic change. Jessica and Ryan lost their careers instantly. No one escapes the consequences of discrimination. What do you think about this? Punishment? Comment your thoughts and where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to spread the message of justice.